Hello, yes, I'm Axel Rossberg, and I'm reader for theoretical ecology, and I work on problems related to biodiversity in general, and general problems about asking, for example, why are there so many species as we see? Typical question is, in the North Sea there are around 200 species of fish, and you could ask yourself, why not only 20? Or why only 2? Or why not 20,000? Why 200? And we believe we have an answer to that, but it's a work in progress. We're working ourselves towards understanding the detailed mechanisms of why this is so. And more recently I started to work on linking biodiversity conservation, biodiversity protection to businesses and financial industry. So how can we motivate financial industry to be less impactful on biodiversity, or to actually do something to preserve biodiversity or to help it recover?
What does biodiversity mean to you?
It's a very good question, because one of the big problems we have, there are different conceptions of biodiversity. The general definition accepted by the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, it has at least 3 components. One is the genetic diversity, diversity of species, and diversity of ecosystems. The way you approach these 3 aspects of biodiversity are already very different. I believe the most important is the biodiversity of species. Why that? First of all, historically, that's where people started to think about biodiversity. When they started to coin the term biodiversity in the early 80s, they were thinking of global loss of species. And so that's where I currently put my effort in the question, how can we prevent species from going extinct, or how can we reduce global extinction risk? And then biodiversity is actually measured in terms of global extinction risk. The more species there are with low abundance, the higher the extinction risk, and in this sense, the lower the biodiversity. So this is all for the benefit of future generations. We conserve these species not for ourselves, but for the future. We also want some benefits of all these species. We don't only work for the benefit of future generations. How can we benefit from all these species? There is another aspect of biodiversity, which is the beauty of natural ecosystems. Natural ecosystems provide ecosystem services to us, such as fresh air, clean water, protection from storms, pollination, food, and the stabilization of the soil. And in order to do this, we need many different species working together. And so this kind of many different species working together, you could also consider as an aspect of biodiversity. If you decide which one is your biodiversity, which is the important one, and forget the others, then you're lost, because you only kind of see half of the picture. And for me, it's important to convince people that you have to always have both in mind: the benefit of current generations and the benefits of future generations. You shouldn't prioritize one over the other. You have to have a balance between the two.
Why do you think biodiversity is so important?
First of all, people feel it's important. If you ask people, what do you think about species going extinct? Everybody is worried about this. Everybody is concerned. It's just an intuition we have. And anyone could argue, well, because it takes so much time to get them back once they're lost. That would be one reason for me. People value biodiversity for so many different reasons. I personally like birds, but I enjoy listening to the sound. I simply find, oh, it's beautiful. And so I don't want to lose that. I enjoy walking through the forest and having all these different smells, and this kind of particular air of the forest, and touching the ground and saying, oh, there's some life in it. Yes, but other people value biodiversity for other things. So the farmer values biodiversity because of pollination services that you get, or the farmer maybe values bird biodiversity because the birds catch all the insects. That's the interesting thing, that there's such a large variety of ways people value biodiversity. People have made lists that goes in the hundreds of different reasons why we value biodiversity. They call it ecosystem services, 100 or more different kinds of ecosystem services. And it does huge amounts of reasons to value biodiversity.
How is biodiversity traditionally measured or monitored, and does this need to change?
Good question. I like that one. There are very different ways in which people monitor biodiversity. One of them, the simplest one, is species richness. Now, strangely, we develop theoretical models of biodiversity and what controls biodiversity, and it turns out that in these models, actually, species richness is maybe the most important parameter. It's or the most important measure of biodiversity. No, actually, this thing that really matters for these mathematical models is species richness, and therefore I think, okay, yeah, maybe species richness is the measure to use. You just have to be careful how to do how you do the lower cutoff in abundance. And in the end, apparently it boils down to species richness as an important measure, and it's different from biomass. So there is biomass and species richness, and if you both kind of captured, then you have good description, I think, on a very high level description of the biodiversity that is there. These two are to describe biodiversity locally. You go to some place, you say, okay, there are so many species and there is so much biomass. And then, of course, you can graduate it. You can go by taxonomic groups or by functional groups or below ground and above ground. But essentially, you always want to ask these two questions. And then there is this other aspect of biodiversity, which is global extinction risk, which is very different. And so I think that we should also think about how to measure global extinction risk. And our theory, interesting, says that we can measure changes in global extinction risk in terms of changes in the living planet index. Basically, you try to estimate the abundance of many different species and ask how the geometric mean of the abundances of all these species changes through time. Change relative to some baseline is the living planet index. And it goes up, down. If the living planet index goes down, then mean extinction risk goes up, and vice versa. And and it's a different way of measuring biodiversity, the living planet index, different from total biomass, which other people do, and it's different from species richness, but it's an important way to measure biodiversity because it tells us about how biodiversity will change in the future.
What are you currently working on which focuses on biodiversity?
So we found, interestingly, that if you simulate spatially extended ecosystems, then first of all, there is a local limit to biodiversity, how many species can coexist, and the species richness of the local communities is constrained. And the number of species you see locally does not depend on how many species are regionally in the system. So you can have a system with high gamma diversity, with high regional diversity, and with low regional diversity, but locally the same number of species coexisting. Only if the regional diversity becomes very low, then locally also you start to lose species. If you know there's a limit to the number of species that can coexist, but if there are lots of species around, if the regional diversity is very high, then some of the species that regionally exist can invade the local community. And then they invade and they change the ecological network. Some species grow in abundance, others decline in abundance, and sometimes some species go extinct. And actually, the system operates so that on average with each invasion of a species from the regional species pool, locally another species goes extinct. And therefore locally the species richness stays the same. We now try to see how can we see evidence for this process operating in nature, for this permanent turnover driven by regional invasions. And it appears that there is. The difficulty is that at the same time you have global environmental change. And so what you need to do is differentiate the species turnover driven by environmental change from the species turnover driven by random invasions from the regional species pool. But we believe there is good evidence that for this natural intrinsic turnover which does not depend on environmental change. And interestingly, I would argue that much of the turnover that people associate with environmental change, or you say, oh, this community changed and therefore somehow the environment changed, is actually a natural process that is not really evidence of environmental change driving things.
What are some challenges you face in researching biodiversity?
For me, and that goes through the ecology as a whole, I think the understanding things is not so difficult, but getting other people to understand it is much more difficult. So we use mathematical arguments, these models, and then we analyze the models mathematically to explain what they are doing, Then we compare the model predictions to data, and surprisingly often we have very good agreement with data. And so we would argue, okay, the model reproduces lots of different aspects of data. We understand the model mathematically, we know the mechanism, so we understand what's going on in nature. That's how I think science would work. You can understand lots of questions related to biodiversity, but you have to learn the math. If you don't learn the math, you will always feel it's difficult. You will always feel, oh, I have to collect more data. And in the end, you will never succeed because the answers are, in the end, mathematical answers.
What inspired you to specialize in theoretical ecology with a focus on biodiversity?
I was trained as a theoretical physicist. I started working on different kinds of complex systems, and I learned a lot about methods that you can use to analyze and to understand complex systems. And at some point, somebody told me, like, why don't you kind of study this lake food web? I said, okay, lake food web. I can do that. I have my methods. And I asked him, so what is the model? What kind of model do you use to describe these lake food webs? And if you tell me, I will analyze the model. And it turns out there was no good model. So I started to build food web models. And then quickly you see, okay, there is a distribution of biodiversity in the food web model. Can I understand that? And can I understand otherwise the aspects of the structure of food webs? And so I started to look at biodiversity in the sense, and the nice thing is from somebody who likes these complex system approaches is in biodiversity science, there's so many things that can be done. You can apply these methods, you can get results, and the results answer questions that people have asked. And so it's satisfying in the sense, and hopefully useful. And to make it even more useful, we are now looking at the problem of financing biodiversity conservation, making businesses more green in the sense that their impact on biodiversity declines.